4 or 5 years ago, I was fishing with this guy. He was showing me this Abbott lever drag reel he had. We was fishing in the fall when you hook big fish anyway. A fish came by and hit a fresh piece of skipjack on his rod. So he picks the rod up, locks her in, and hands it to me. Next thing you know, I realize I've got a really big fish on there. I'm estimating 60 pounds. And all of a sudden that fish gave a really hard pull. I felt this big pop, and that was it. The fish was gone. I realized he had that lever drag just as tight as you could possibly get the drag with braided line, which has absolutely no give at all. What happened? I know what happened. That fish was hooked in the corner of his mouth, and that fish ripped the side of his mouth out and got off the hook. A couple years ago, that fish is actually on video. Weighed about 50 pounds. I had my drag set, somewhat tight, but had a little bit of a give. I got that fish in, and it pulled so hard, it had tore about a 3-inch gash in the side of its mouth. I was lucky to have got that fish in, but I did. Big fish can pull hard. And even with my drag somewhat set, he was basically outrunning the drag and managed to tear his mouth. Guys that have fished for a while for big fish have lost fish over the same situation. Bottom line is you need some give. Braid has absolutely no give at all. Mono or braid, braid or mono, both have pros and cons. One thing I used to like about mono over braid was the fact that mono was a lot cheaper. Lately I have discovered that there are cheap, I guess generic forms of braid that are actually good line, and they are so cheap that really there isn't much cost difference. The problem is which one is better. One thing I like about braid is the fact of its smaller diameter. I can get a bunch of line on a small reel like that little Abbott and still have plenty of line left. With my mono reels, I need a little bigger capacity reel to be able to hold 40 to 50 pound mono. The reason I go with such a heavy line, it's not necessarily for the breaking strength, but for the abrasion resistance of the line rubbing the bottom and rocks, such. The no stretch of braid makes hook sets a little quicker, a little easier. The fact I'm using heavier mono, the heavier mono tends to stretch less, or it is harder to stretch, but still has a little more give. Where I make up for that is those Daiwa reels have a very high retrieve ratio, making it easy to take stretch out of the line simply by reeling down on the reel. When it comes to tying knots, I would definitely prefer mono. It's easier to get a hold of and manage while tying a knot. Trying to tie braid in the wind or at night, I absolutely hate it. When I'm running 50 pound mono, I can get by without a top shot. When I'm running that braid, I like to tie an extra top shot of 80 pound mono for abrasion resistance on the business end. I probably got about 25 foot of top shot on that Abbott. 80 pound Andy Blue Monster. So the braid is a little more difficult to tie, then plus I add a top shot to it. That piece of cut crappie just got hit by something. Very subtle bite. Could be a turtle, could be a winter flathead. I'll keep my eye on it. I'm using heavy rods, very heavy action. And I'm getting some give in the mono. Not quite so much shock when a big bend gets into the rod. When I'm running braid, I need even more give. And the way I get that give, since my rod is so stiff, is to simply run my drag a little bit looser. If there's no give, bad things can happen, people. I run that Abbott tight enough to set the hook, but plenty of give in case a fish wants to run, and so it don't rip the hook out of its mouth. I heard of a guy, he was selling all his big cat fever rods. He kept saying he was missing fish on them. The reason he was missing the fish is because he was using heavy wire hooks, and the big cat fever rod has a soft tip. If the fish wouldn't pull extremely hard, those tips would not set into the fish's mouth due to the soft point of the rod. This is why when guys got rods and boat holders and they see it go down a little bit, they reach over to the reel handle and put a really good bend in the rod by cranking down on the reel. If you're running a soft tip rod in a rod holder, you better reach over and crank down on that reel to get everything good and tight to set that hook. Doing a little late morning trip just outside of downtown Kingston. Nothing real special about this place other than it is on an outside bend. I've got two baits real close to the channel drop. I've got that big piece of crappie, somewhat shallower water. I'm simply not going to cast that bigger reel far enough to hit it. And the fact I have a wind coming into me, I'm surely not going to hit it. If the wind was to my back, I could probably get all three rods out a good distance. Braided line tends to be a little less forgiving when it gets nicked on rocks and stuff. The mono, or at least certain types of mono, will stand up better to rocky environments. There really is no perfect line. One really isn't better than the other. You just need to understand both types of line and where definitely not to use the braid. If I could only have a choice of one line to run, I would pick the mono. But since I do have a choice, I've got both, and I'll learn to deal with both. Probably the only reason I even fool with the braid now is the fact that they do have more cost-effective options out there. That reaction braid was very cost-effective. It's a 4-strand, it's a little bit rougher, but I've had no issues at all as far as strength or inconsistencies. There's other brands out there I've heard people talk about. Cast King, Hercules. What I will not do is pay the price of Suffix and Power Pro. Woo! I believe it's January 4th. We've got some river rise going on. Cold front blew through yesterday. I believe there was 8 boats sunk yesterday at a catfish tournament on Wheeler Reservoir due to high winds. I'm gonna flip this camera around where the sun is behind the camera. A piece of crappie in the shallowest water got the first fish. The other two are baited with gizzard shad. I'll try another piece of crappie. Another little bitty fish. You never see people fish this park because usually if you don't get way out, you don't get much here. That drop off is way out by that buoy out there. It's quite a ways out. Again, I've got heavy gear. My drag is set tight enough to set the hook, but I can pull it out relatively easy too. Of course, if I ever need to reach down and tighten it more during a fight, I can. But at least I know I'm in the safe zone with it set at the tension that it is. Tight enough to set the hook, tight enough to pull a fish in, but not so tight that it's going to rip anything out of his mouth. If you're running a rod that's got a lot more bend in it, then you could probably run your drag even a little tighter because the rod itself has some give. All my gear is heavy action, so I need give somewhere. So my give is in the drag itself. But you gotta have it or bad things happen with big fish. You should always double check your drag before the first cast of each trip because these stars can get knocked around sometimes putting them in and out of the truck. They can get too tight or even too loose. So I always give it a pull and make sure it's to my liking. I've had them get knocked to where they was too tight and lost fish over it. This one here is tight enough to set the hook, tight enough to pull a fish in, but plenty of give if he wants to run. It's a slow bite so far today. We've actually got a daytime moon up over there. I didn't expect this to be a big fish spot, to be honest with you. I've never really got anything here over upper 30s. It's usually a consistent place to get a hookup. I figured I'd do a little bit of talk on the subjects I've been talking about and do that talk from the water. This was an easy spot to set up. Parking lot right behind me. I think this is called 58 Landing, if I'm not mistaken. You can see the steam plant right over there. So far, a couple small fish, and I haven't got the first fish big enough to play any bluegrass music yet. Hopefully one of those comes along. I'm not going to stay out late. Just thought I'd throw a little bait. Talk to y'all about line, drag, sit around here and wait. Ain't got one big enough for a bluegrass song, but I'm going to sit a little longer and hope one comes along. All right, people, it's been a very dead day out here. We've got 3 different kind of baits in the water: cut crappie, gizzard shad, chunk of frozen skipjack, just 2 small fish. It's obviously a very dead bite. I'm in for me, a pretty productive spot in the river because I'm getting my baits out of ways. This is an outside bend right here, and it typically holds fish through the winter. This is probably about the worst day I've ever had out here, but we're having a mild winter. Temps got up to like 48 today. It's been up and down, colder, warmer, but never really getting cold and staying cold. Also a lot of rain, raising the river, lowering the river. Just isn't what I hoped for today. It is what it is. I got to come out, talk about how I set my drags, why I set my drags. Gotta have some give. I didn't need it today, but if I keep plugging away, another fish is gonna come along and test me for the day. That's when everything's gotta be right. This is Catfish Dave coming at you from Kingston, Tennessee. This is a video. There was a couple fish in the video. That makes it a fishing video. This is Catfish Dave with another one, signing out.